God sends his son Jesus to pay for our debt, to repair that relationship. It's unmerited, undeserving, and unearned favor. And the same week that my preschoolers learned about Peter, I then sat in the second service and Stan spoke of Paul and the grace on his life. And then last week, Pastor Stan talked about Peter. And he listed 3 things that Peter did right. Do you remember? He said Peter grieved his failure, he did life with a group, and he embraced the grace and mercy of God. So I want to extend on embracing the grace and mercy of God. So several years back, I found myself in a situation where I found freedom in that truth. And it took some messing up. See, I had gone out with a bunch of work friends to celebrate a birthday, and I fell into sin, and I drank too much, and I became drunk. And the next day, I was so ashamed. I remember just feeling worthless. I was living a Christian life, and I was walking with God, but I failed. And drinking wasn't a habit for me. I was experiencing shame. And you know what it felt like? I felt like that puppy with my nose in my pee. And that is when I thought, isn't this exactly where the enemy wants me? Feeling worthless, cowering. It was in that moment I realized that I was wasting precious kingdom time wallowing in my shame. Now I grieved, I did, and I repented, and I asked God for forgiveness. I asked God to make me strong enough not to put myself in that situation again. But I made a decision to embrace the grace and mercy of God and walk in victory of that grace. Does that make sense? Like it was, yes, I messed up, and I'm sorry, God. Hey, but let's move on. Let's be used by God. So how do we walk in victory? I want to read to you a lengthy passage. It's from Romans 5:18, and we're going to read through 6:5. And the translation, or actually the paraphrase that I chose is from the Message. It's a great, this is a great passage, and if you have time to go back and look at it in your translation you prefer, it's beautiful, but it takes time to really think through, process, and unpack. And so I'm going to use the paraphrase of that just because I think it lays out such a good image. So here we go. It says, here it is in a nutshell. Just as one person did it wrong and got us all in this trouble with sin and death, another person, Jesus, did it right and got us out of it. But more than just getting us out of trouble, he got us into life. One man said no to God and put many people in the wrong. One man said yes to God and put many people in the right. All that passing laws against sin did was produce more lawbreakers. But sin didn't and doesn't have a chance in competition with the aggressive forgiveness we call grace. When it's sin versus grace, grace wins hands down. All sin can do is threaten us with death, and that's the end of it. Grace, because God is putting everything together again through the Messiah, invites us into life, a life that goes on and on and on, world without end. So what do? Keep on sinning so God can keep on forgiving? I should hope not. If we've left the country where sin is sovereign, how can we still live in our old house there? Or didn't you realize you packed up and left there for good? That is what happened in baptism. When we went under the water, we left the old country of sin behind. And when we came up out of the water, we entered into the new country of grace, a new life in a new land. That's what baptism into the life of Jesus means. When we are lowered into the water, it is like the burial of Jesus. And when we are raised out of the water, it is like the resurrection of Jesus. Each of us is raised into a light-filled world of our Father so that we can see where we're going in our new grace sovereign country. The ESV translations for Romans 6:4 says, just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. We have the power to walk in newness, confident of the grace that is given so freely to us. Does this make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm not saying that we continue in sin. No, rather, if you are in a relationship with Jesus Christ, you should certainly be resisting sin. But when you fail, be confident in that grace. See, if you know Jesus and he has your heart, how else can the enemy come at us? By making us feel worthless, so that you will be distracted long enough to not see that Jesus has purpose for your life if you'll just walk confidently in his grace. So 2 ways I want to give you that we can walk in grace. And the first one is particularly tough. It says, you must become less important. So number 1, you must become less important. In Matthew 16:24, it says, then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Do you know what it means to deny yourself? It's a humbling experience. This is no longer about you. It never was. It means denying your passions, denying your pleasures, your selfishness to follow God. John 3:30 says, he must become greater and I must become less important. Galatians 2:20 says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So I'm not saying that you can't work hard for things in life, or that you can't save money and buy nice toys. That's not what this is about. It's about an attitude of the heart. If we live in a world that thinks we deserve things, right? Like, I deserve a raise because I worked hard for that. I deserve good service because I'm a patron here. Or in my case, I deserve dessert. I worked out. That's funny, but it's real. So number 1, you must become less important. It's not about you. It's about denying yourself to follow Jesus. It's about his name, his glory, his story. So number 2, extend grace to others in all circumstances. The story I'm going to read from Matthew is one that Jesus is telling, that he's teaching about forgiveness. And it certainly is, but this is also a message about grace. So we're going to take a look at Matthew 18:23 through 34. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who decided to collect the money his servants owed to him. When the king began to collect his money, a servant who owed him several $1 million was brought to him, but the servant did not have enough money to pay his master, the king. So the master ordered that everything the servant owned should be sold, even the servant's wife and children. Then the money would be used to pay the king what the servant owed. But the servant fell on his knees and begged, be patient with me, and I will pay you everything I owe. And the master, he felt sorry for his servant, and he told him he did not have to pay him back. Then he let the servant go free. Later, that same servant found another servant who owed him just a few dollars. The servant grabbed him around the neck and said, pay me the money you owe me. And the other servant fell on his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I will pay you everything I owe. But the first servant refused to be patient. He threw the other servant into prison until he could pay everything he owed. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were very sorry. So they went and told their master all that had happened. Then the master called his servant in and said, you evil servant, because you begged me to forget what you owed, I told you that you did not have to pay anything. You should have shown mercy to that other servant, just as I showed mercy to you. The master was angry and put the servant in prison to be punished until he could pay everything he owed. See, the story is about us. God is our king, our master, and he has forgiven us, shown us grace and mercy by sending Jesus, his only son, to die for us, to pay our debt. So we should be filled with so much love and so much gratitude that we, in return, are dishing out grace to others in all circumstances everywhere we go. But how else can we be like Jesus? So here are 3 principal areas for grace in your life. And I think there's a lot of areas where we can apply grace, but I just picked 3. And I think they're 3 particularly tough ones. Number 1, behavior. 2 Corinthians 1:12 says, "Now this is our boast. Our conscience testifies that we have conducted ourselves in the world, and especially in our relations with you, with integrity and godly sincerity. We have done so relying not on worldly wisdom, but on God's grace." See, worldly wisdom tells us to be rude to someone because they were rude to me. Worldly wisdom tells me to be impatient when someone is taking too long and I'm in a hurry. Worldly wisdom tells me not to tip a waiter because of poor service. So I worked in a restaurant once. I was a waitress, and I'll tell you, I hated it. Did not enjoy it one bit, and for more reasons than one. But one of the things that I learned while waitressing is that Sunday lunch was known as the worst shift by any waiter. That's the church crowd, and they don't tip. And see, I didn't believe it, but it is true. And just to be fair, there are good people, and there are good godly people that did tip also. And I was also in South Carolina, so there's a lot of Baptists there, so I don't know. But I'll tell you, they're not only do they not tip, but they're often rude, and yet will still put a salvation track in within the paid bill when it's over. And one time in particular, I remember, I had a collection of these tracts that people had given me, and I kept them in my apron just because. Maybe I could give them out. And I had a table one time, and I could tell they'd come from church. They were in their Sunday best, just completely dressed up, and they didn't really talk to me the whole time, didn't try to interact, and I tried to think of myself as a bubbly, friendly person, but nothing. I mean, other than what they wanted, there was no conversation. And so by the end of this, I was kind of ready for this to be over with and be done with. I was on my way to their table with the bill, and I noticed the guy had a track ready to go for me. And my thought as I'm walking was, I should put a track in the bill and just give it to him first, beat him to it, right? But my feet walked faster than my brain thought, and so I ended up giving the guy, didn't act upon it. And sure enough, he did leave me a track in with the paid bill. I was like, rats, I missed my opportunity. This story has nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but I just thought it was fun and I'd share with you. So I understand, I do. I understand that it's easy to be frustrated when you're paying for a service to a person who isn't refilling your drink or doesn't get your order right or just never shows up after your food has been served. But I want to remind you of 2 important things. Number 1, you don't know what that person is going through. Maybe they're having a bad day, or maybe this is a student that is consumed with the paper they have to write, but they're here working, trying to pay for their education. Or maybe no one ever taught them how to be friendly. Or maybe they just don't know Jesus like you do. And number 2, it doesn't matter what they're going through because you're supposed to be denying yourself. It's important. We should consider those things. We should consider, they must be having a rough day. I don't know this person. I don't know what they're going through. But with that, does it really matter? Does it matter? Because what matters is your walk with Christ. And you're supposed to be picking up that cross and carrying it. You're called, we're all called to be the light in darkness, the salt of the earth. So be salty in all circumstances to everyone. I'm not saying to let someone walk over you, all over you. We're not called to be a doormat. Or I'm not saying to tip poor service with an exceptionally high tip. But be kind. Extend grace. So number 1 is our behavior. We can extend grace in our behavior. Number 2, our speech. Ouch. Colossians 4:6. says, "Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone." This one's especially hard, and it can be especially hard with loved ones, right? Because these are the people that you're closest to. Like you know their goods and you know their bads. And it's hard when it comes to loved ones and family members. Well, some of you may know that I actually spent a couple years working at a Christian camp as a kitchen director, which is interesting, but I loved it. I lived in North Carolina, and I did it full time, and I grew up at this camp, and it was amazing. I grew to love the people I work with. In fact, we not only worked together, but we lived together. Like, everybody had a house, like, all in the same, on this mountain. So you did everything together, and also you're on a mountain, so there wasn't a lot to do, so anytime we did something, it was like, hey, you're my friend, let's go hang out. So I gotta tell you, though, because of that, during this time, this was a major growing point for me in my life. The Lord stretched me in ways I didn't think I could be stretched. And he chiseled away at pieces of me that weren't of him. And one of those flaws was my mouth. See, I was a particularly mouthy and sarcastic kid. And so I kind of grew into a particularly mouthy and sarcastic person. And what I realized is that I could say some really ugly things. If someone wasn't doing something that I didn't like, or I didn't agree with, or something that wasn't right, I would bite with my words. In that time, God revealed to me how ugly I was because of the lack of grace in my words. How can I be a light? How can I be Jesus if my words are constantly dripping with hate or sarcasm or just meanness? And it was an uphill battle. It was painful experience. But I had to learn to control my speech and extend grace. And it was hard work. It took great effort. It meant shutting my mouth and thinking and processing before I said something, no matter what they said, no matter if I disagreed or didn't like how they did it. Okay, how can I say this in a way that extends grace and shows love? And it was hard. I had to realize that it's not about me. I had to learn how to extend grace in my speech. And just a reminder that you have to remember that when you say something, they're out there. You may apologize and ask for forgiveness, but you can't take them back. They're always out there. Number 3, service. 1 Peter 4:10 says, each of you has received a gift to use to serve others. Be good servants of God's various gifts of grace. When I sat down to write this, and the Lord put these 3 things on my heart, I was excited. I was like, yeah, service. And then I thought, and I was like, what does that mean? How do we extend grace and service? Okay, God, you've given me this point, but where do I go from here? And so this is what I've got, and this is what he's given me. We all have a gift, and hopefully you know yours. And if you don't, we offer a class where you can learn about that gift in the growth track. But if you know your gift, are you applying your gift in a way that extends grace to other people? Maybe you have a gift of compliments, of using your words, kindly. Do you think to pay compliments to strangers, maybe to someone who needs to hear a kind word that day? Just a thought. I love when I'm in a random place and someone will just come up and say something to me, just nice, It's like, I don't know you, but that was so nice. It makes your day, And so it's impactful. Maybe your gifting is giving time. And that can be a tough one, but maybe that means we extend grace by putting aside our time so that we can help a friend move. Or maybe it means just staying and talking and having a conversation a little longer rather than rushing off. For me, I enjoy helping people, especially when I know that I'm lightening their load. But sometimes that's really hard with my schedule, and sometimes I don't want to. But I make it work when I can. I try to think about, how can we extend that grace? And so, guys, I want us to think about this word. Grace is not a word to take lightly. So when we sing, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. That's the same sweet grace we need to extend to others. That's the same sweet grace that we need to show people so that they can see it too, so that they can come in and no longer be blind but see. The last thing I want to add, and Pastor Stan says this so well, so I'm just going to quote him. When you blow it, own it. See, we're all human and we're going to mess up. It's inevitable, unfortunately. I wish it weren't. It'd be nice just to start your day and be like, I'm not going to sin. But it doesn't happen. So when you mess up, it's okay, but own up to it. You know, it takes boldness and bravery, and it might even feel awkward to tell somebody, I'm sorry I said that to you. I'm sorry I behaved in that way. Will you forgive me? And the more you do it, the easier it becomes, and the more you extend grace. Because even in that moment, owning up to it, you're extending grace. So this week, my challenge to you is to go with God and extend grace everywhere you go. In all circumstances, let it just flood over you and think about it this week as we go out. Will you pray with me?